the so what to that is that risk is a long-term play. It is
Mm,
not something that is measured in terms of success incident by incident or risk by risk. So what it's not is clairvoyance, and what it's not
mm,
is the ability to eliminate uncertainty, not the ticket to avoiding shocks. It's not the ticket to avoiding mistakes. You can't just create value out of thin air. Risk is actually the fuel of growth. You have to take those risks.
Welcome to Strategy Meets Reality podcast. I'm your host, Mike Jones, and today I'm joined by Stefan Gershater, Head of Risk and Governance at the Co-op. We dig into why traditional risk management is broken, how to reframe risk as decision support, and why the future of risk isn't about heat maps or compliance. It's about enabling better decisions, building resilience, and creating value. Welcome to Strategy Meets Reality podcast. I am joined by Stefan Gershater, Head of Risk at Co-op, and it's so great to have you on the show today.
Right? Nice to be here.
Cool. Um, just for our viewers, if you don't mind giving a bit of context of what you've been up to lately, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm head of risk and governance services at Co-op, so my world really revolves around, yes, understanding risk, but also putting it in a very practical context, as would it be implied by the governance side of things. We're midway through a risk transformation project, a 3-year effort. Been at the Co-op for 18 months, and yeah, I won't be. I'm not ashamed to say it. We're you never hear people say that they're doing really well, but actually, I'm having the best professional 12 to 18 months of my life. I feel culturally like I've landed in a place in the co-op where that aligns very much to my values, and turns out that values are really important and very motivating when they're conducive to what you want to achieve. So what are we doing? It's really full stack in terms of looking at risk. We're looking at our risk framework. That's all the stuff you'd expect around how to assess risk, how to manage it. But actually, the most important bit is how to contextualize risk. And the way
Mm,
that we've set about that is to place every risk that we talk about in the context of objectives, which I suspect is a useful thing for you to know for this next for the time that you and I are going to spend talking together. So that's been really interesting. Some really interesting adventures into technology land, the kind of useful technologies that exist. Personally, I've been quite a make kind of guy. I've made my own tools. This time I've been persuaded to buy something. So that's been quite
no.
an adventure. And then the focus, I guess, in terms of making risk useful, embedding risk in decision making. Every head of risk wants to be that person who says that they've successfully done that. I think at the ripe old age of 47, I may be doing that. So that's
Okay.
exciting. And
Yes.
defining the handoffs between risk and portfolio management, risks and strategy, risk and finance, and so on. So yeah, the last 18 months have been very full but very fulfilling.
Awesome. And I think I'm dying to get into that around the transformation, especially when you say risk and strategy, risk and finance. Often these things are done in isolation. But the reason why I really wanted to get you on is because we've had a few chats before, and I've seen what you post up, and you seem to have a different perspective or a new unique perspective I see around risk. So if there was a one orthodoxy you think we most urgently need to challenge for your perspective of risk, what would that be, and why do you think it's still hanging around?
I get into trouble periodically because I talk about this orthodoxy, and the problem with orthodoxies are that if you challenge them, you're going to upset somebody. And so I
Yeah.
invariably upset entirely unintentionally. I tend to upset lawyers, accountants, and auditors. Let me say, having not said it in other forums, let me say first and foremost that I respect those professions and the professionals who work within them. That is
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
what this is about. This is about an orthodoxy that comes about because of a way that those professions are taught to think.
Yes.
And to understand it, you've actually got to go back over 10,000 years to ancient Mesopotamia. And you've got to understand where accounting comes from as an art. And it's to do with fascinating things like the birth of civilization and the birth of writing and the birth of mathematics, because all of those things came about through the industrialization of food production and agriculture. And as soon
Yeah.
as people realized that food equals power, and that power was something that needed to be protected, you had to protect not just food, the means of food production, but also the means for keeping track of how much food you were creating and where it was being stored. And eventually, as currency came along, how much you paid for it. And so the first records of human written script was something
Yeah.
called cuneiform alpha. And one of the earliest surviving examples of cuneiform is a receipt for two cows. And
Wow.
in modern day Iraq, so in the I've forgotten, I think it's a town called Ur, so it's spelled U-R, somewhere around there, this receipt was discovered. And I actually did a talk in the Middle East, and I put a picture of this up, and I said, "Who knows what that is?" And somebody in the audience just read it and just said, "Yeah, cuneiform alpha, it's a receipt to cow." Why is that so important? Why was that? Why did we invest as a species so much effort into creating the very first written language and then its application being to record a transaction? Well, it's because transactions are vitally important, and the rules that govern them and the way that we record them are equally important. And that's become accounting, right? That was the birth of
Yes.
accounting. It extends that logic that came from 10,000 years ago. The orthodoxy is born of the idea that if you mess those rules up, and those rules have burgeoned and become more complex, and
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
spend your entire life studying them, but effectively, the risk of misaccounting or financial misstatement, because you can go to prison for it, still, ultimately,
Mm.
you could.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's where this orthodoxy comes from. So it's not just been drummed into us over tens or hundreds or even thousands of years, over 10,000 years of reinforcement that this is something that's so fundamental to our society that if you make a transaction that you have to record it appropriately, and therefore everything else that comes since. We've become very narrow in terms of how we consider this phenomenon called risk, and we've
Yeah.
centered it on the risk of messing up a rule around or rules around financial misstatement or misaccounting. So that's where the orthodoxy comes from. And there's a whole industrial complex that's built up to support that
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
view. So the big four and the other accounting firms, well, they are absolutely focused on financial controls. That's what they're interested in. It is an extension of what we're talking about. They're absolutely dead set that if you want to run a successful business, all you need to do and all their expertise is stacked. I mean, legion consultants stacked up and waiting to pour in through your front door as a business to come and help you understand purchase to pay, order to cash, record to report. All of that. Of course, you've got to be good at those things. But
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
what they're geared up ready to do, because the consequences of cocking it up is that you go to prison. Fine. You've got to step back from that, though, and understand what risk is actually about. And
Mm.
there, I'm not I'm not one for standards, but actually there the ISO for this is really helpful. ISO 31000, the risk ISO, says that the definition of risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. It doesn't say that the
Yes.
definition of
Yes.
risk is your chance of going to jail if you write down a transaction incorrectly. It says it's about objectives. It says it's about getting stuff done,
Yes.
and stuff that might move you off course and mean that you achieve something different. And so that's a very long way of answering your question, but that's how the orthodoxy came to be. And then the reality of what we're actually being asked to do is very, very different. But we seem unable to extract ourselves from a received way of thinking And I think
Yes.
there is both challenge and opportunity around that.
Yeah, and I can see that because we're talking about how do we execute our aims or objectives in this uncertain, complex world, and that comes quite difficult. It becomes even more difficult if the orthodoxy is strapping you down to set processes, set plans that have to agree. It restricts you from having that adaptability. Where I really like your definition of risk there around that uncertainty around achieving your objectives, and there always is going to be that uncertainty. So how do you as a risk guy, I'm going to call you risk guy, head of risk,
The risk guy.
what do you advise leaders now and how they can use risk or understand risk better to help them achieve their objectives?
I've spent my whole professional life thinking about this. Maybe 27 years in now, I'm starting to be able to build a narrative that is actually helpful. So I'll share some thoughts. So the first thing is to set expectations around what risk management can and can't deliver. So what it's not is clairvoyance, and what it's not
Mm,
is the ability to eliminate uncertainty, not the ticket to avoiding shocks. It's not the ticket to avoiding mistakes. It doesn't do that. When I try to explain this to people who understand sports or gambling, there's loads of different ways you can explain it, but risk management is a bit like marginal gains in sports,
mm,
so rowing or rugby or tennis or whatever it happens to be, or it's a bit like counting cards in blackjack.
yeah.
So the so what to that is that risk is a long-term play. It is
Mm,
not something that is measured in terms of success incident by incident or risk by risk. It's measured in a year by year, 2, 3, 4, 5 year return. The illustrations, incidentally, are fun around. So tennis is a great speech by Roger Federer. Um, he did I think they call it a commencement speech in America, basically a graduation ceremony where he was encouraging the graduates to think long term and not focus on failure, but to play each point for sure,
mm,
but ultimately to measure success over years and years and not even game by game. What was interesting there was that although he won some vast majority of the Grand Slams that he played in, he only won 54% of the points that he ever played, right? So
oh,
he lost a colossal number of points, but actually is one of the most successful tennis players of our time. And
yeah.
again, in a risk context, that's really important that we don't go, well, you didn't see Trump's tariffs coming. If you messed up. Actually, it's not about that. It's about resilient organizations in the face of uncertainty, and that's again what risk helps to do. Again, the blackjack example is if you're good at counting cards, if you're good at understanding the cards that have been and therefore the cards that are going to come, you can just about tilt the odds about 51-49 in your favor. But that's after playing hand after hand after hand. You have to sit at the table for hours and hours and hours and hours for those odds to come right. So the first thing I would say is it's about setting expectations around what risk is and isn't, and also that it is a longer term play. Really hard given that most organizations look for an in-year ROI against
Yes.
investments. So when you're
Yeah,
trying
yeah.
to explain to a CFO that actually I'd really rather you sign a check at the moment for new people or new technology or whatever it is, great. What's my ROI on this and when can I expect it? Is it Q1, Q2? Well, it's somewhat longer than that. It's a hard sell. It's
Yeah, yeah.
difficult. And then the second point that I'd make is that you have to look at risk as a system. So how do you systematize risk? Rather than creating long lists of scary things that might happen and putting them in front of the board twice a year, you have to look for opportunities and look for people who will entertain conversations with you around their objectives. So that's what I mean by risk as a system. Understanding how risk flows in from the outside. How is our market headroom being governed by risks which are working that we can't affect, but that we have to be aware of?
Yeah.
How does that help us as an organization set good objectives? How do we set a good strategy in the face of that? Risk informed strategy. And then on the execution side of things, where have I got risks in my functions, in my enablers that mean that that strategy, I might not achieve all of the value that that strategy could deliver? So really looking at risk as a flow rather than just lists of risks and risk registers and that heat maps and so on. People tend to get a bit distracted by the artifacts rather
Yes,
than
yeah, yeah,
the work. So
yes,
those would be the two areas that I would be focusing on.
yeah. I think that's great, a great advice. And you see this when we're developing strategy. The strategy is, always informed from the external environment. What, as you said, flows in, but also tempered by our ability internally. So I have to see there's a mismatch there between what we're trying to achieve externally and then what we can achieve internally. That disconnection. So there's always going to be risks
That's right.
that we can't affect, and there are risks to delivery. Our ability to do that and understanding
Yeah,
how we can, adapt or reformulate our strategy in a way that we can
course correct.
manage. Yeah, course correct. It's the cynic in me. I always see it where you, like you said, they go in and all it is just like a risk register, and it's almost like a game. They got a risk, fill it in. This is our mitigation. They put it back in the drawer, and they carry on doing something completely different to anything that you just spoke about in a risk sense.
Yeah.
Crazy.
It's frustrating because you could treat me as part of your extended team, right? That's what I want. Okay, I have a particular way of seeing the world. Um, that is quite a scientific mindset. It's quite a systematic mindset. Again, there's numerous ways that risk people can help elbow their way into a conversation because we have to do this, right? We have to do this. If you're a UK corporate, you've got to do risk. You're obliged to. The Financial
Yeah.
Reporting Council lays that out. So let's just make it useful whilst we're at it, shall we?
Yes.
But the what it's hard to start the conversation. So there's you have to demonstrate to decision makers, to P&L leaders in particular, right? So let's go for the MDs, the P&L, the people who've actually creating value. Let's prioritize them. One flippant way that I open a conversation with people like that is help me to get you your bonus next year. I mean, it's crass,
Yeah.
right? It is really
Yeah. Yeah.
crass. But actually, I mean it because they'll go, well, how? Okay, you've got my attention. Cool. What are your objectives? What have you got to deliver next year? Oh, I've got to, I don't know, create a new product, create a new service, go into a new geography, open some new shops, develop a multi-channel strategy. I've got to hit this number. I've got to hit that number. That's gold dust to a risk guy because actually, let's go back to 31,000. The risk is the effect of uncertainty objectives. Well, you've just been given the objectives, right?
Yes. Yeah.
You've
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
been told the context for your risks. There's a bit of institutional arrogance in risk people in that they want to be the people telling you what the risks are. Well, there's a bit of that. We can explore and test, and part of the value that I bring is understanding frameworks for making sure that that analysis is as thorough as it can be, and that's something that I'm good at. But actually, you're the clever guy in this conversation. You're the one coming up with the strategy. You're the one coming up with the route to market and the
Yeah. Yeah.
way to exploit that market to the fullest extent that we can. What that does is it solves something inherent to risk, which is materiality. So how do I know how much this risk is worth? Because risk has a price, has a value attached to it.
Yeah.
If I know what it is that you're trying to do, if I know what your specific object, literally what is going to get you your bonus paid next year, all of these risks suddenly bring on a new life, a new life. They have a life of their own. They have an energy. They start fizzing because they matter to you, right?
Yeah.
Now you're incentivized. It's suddenly a conversation that you want to be a part of. I get what I want because I'm doing useful risk management, but you get me and my team working on your behalf to help you be more successful. So
Mm.
it's it's actually about just reading the ISO and doing what it says,
Yeah, yeah.
rather than obeying the orthodoxy, which is much narrower.
And I like the way, it comes back to your point earlier around contextualizing risk. And we see when times are tough, or things start to go wrong, as you said, we didn't see Trump's tariffs coming. People start to centralize risk. And I suppose it comes to what you were saying about the arrogancy of some of the risk members, that they try to tell you what the risk is. And what we try to do is they centralize the risk, and they think by centralizing the risk and that understanding, that means you're going to solve risk. But really, what you do is you create risk across the whole system. Um, and by actually pushing, like you said, the people that are closest to the context, by helping supporting them, they're the ones that are understand their objectives, they understand the constraints that they're working in, and with the support of understanding risk, they can adapt a lot quicker, a lot easier.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there's two sides to this. So there's the agility piece. So
Mm,
how, when we detect changes in the risk environment, how do we feed that information through to decision makers to say, I think you need to course adjust your strategy. So there's that. On the other side of that agility piece and the proactive decision making, you've actually got resilience. So how do we build resilience in to organizations by design? How do we build organizations where key bits of process, key bits of infrastructure are identified? Do we even know what we absolutely depend on as a business? And then making sure that the preventative controls stack up to the right amount of protection, so that when there's a shock, um, in the first instance we can resist it, but in the second instance, we can react to it and respond to it. So it's really about agility in terms of being that proactive, forward-looking decision making, and then it's about resilience and resistance to shock. But they're both sides of the same coin.
yeah,
And
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, and yeah, and that's really useful. And we try and help organisations to build resilience, that they have self-organising teams, so the people that are there trying to deliver their objectives, that they actually have the resources available to them to deliver that. Because as soon as then they start having to go outside of their own organisation and engage with other teams, it slows down um, their ability to adapt, or their agility, which isn't good, because as soon as then they get permission to do something, by the time they go to enact it, um, the world's changed slightly, and that's not going to work anymore. So I think providing that ability to self-organize, I think, is crucial.
absolutely. And again, it all comes from objectives. If people think that objectives are just about growth, they're not. They're about protect and grow. So it's about protect. You can have objectives around protecting the value that you're already creating today, which could be more of a resilience focused discussion. But then around your grow risks, the risks to your growth agenda, you can talk about them in the same breath, right? Because
Yeah,
it is just value at the end of the day. But from a risk perspective, you've got to understand how that feels from the MD's perspective. So she or he is not thinking about this holistically. They're thinking about growth targets. They're thinking about revenue up. They're thinking about margin up. They're thinking about cost out. They're constantly driving for that growth objective. It's up to us to make sure that actually they look at protect risks with the same energy. So,
yeah, yeah,
in our context, it takes however many thousands of tins of beans we have to sell to make 100 quid. The way I phrase it to them is, think of the physical effort, just the physical effort it takes to move those tins of beans around, and all of that effort going into earning £100 of margin, only to get it fined off you because you commit a GDPR breach,
yeah,
or a
yeah,
health
yeah,
and safety challenge, or an equal opportunities pay complaint, or whatever it happens to be. And again, if you cite it in those terms, using language that the operators, that the guys at the pointy end would use and recognize, it really serves to engage the audience and your stakeholders in a way that using the language of first, second, and third line assurance and risk and threats and vulnerabilities and goodness knows what else just serves to scare people. It's just so much more effective to use the language of the business and then fit risk language in around that and be seen to be making that effort. So if for no other reason than they're convinced that you find their business interesting.
Yeah, and I think you go down a dangerous path if you start to just make risk about compliance, because then people just start seeing risk and all these other things as just a tick box. I've done this. I've filled in my risk register, instead of actually getting them to realize, even when we do strategy with clients, we're like, right, okay, so you want to do this. What is the likely response for your actions? So who's going to respond in a way that is going to either, help or hinder what you're trying to do? And how would you know that's going to happen? What are the key risks that you can see? And how would you know that those risks are going to appear? And it's just trying to contextualize it in a way that is useful so they can see it rather than just a risk register, I think is crucial.
Yeah, I mean, you're touching on another area that is it's a real passion of mine, and um, I have a few irritating catchphrases that make my team roll their eyes, but one
Can't
of
wait to
them
hear
is
him.
that one of it's not enough to be right. So risk people have that luxury of a group-wide purview. We get to talk to everyone and anyone. We're your therapist, we're your rabbi, priest, imam, pick your holy person of choice. But we tend to hear a lot and we see a lot. So we tend to be more likely than not to be able to see the truth. Unfortunately, nothing turns people off more than somebody being correct. Okay, that's just
Mm,
so annoying.
yeah,
And particularly in retrospect, because oh, what a genius! You
yeah,
look back at the decisions that I took in the moment, and it turns out that I could have done them slightly better. Well, thanks.
yeah. Hindsight's a great thing, isn't it?
What am
Thanks.
I paying you for? So, what it's not enough to be right means is exactly that. How do you communicate risk insight in a way that is accretive and additive to strategy and to that strategy discussion? How do you how do you show that a strategy is more robust because actually you've priced risks in, you've deliberately explored them, you've deliberately defined them in a way that is practical, that's not just something scary that might happen, but actually it's a problem that could really set us off course. And not only that, but I've got you three options for solving it, and the cost of each is here, and the benefit of each is here. I mean, you and I share a common history, right? And we go back
Yeah,
to being a junior officer. It's a bit like tactical planning. It's the estimate process
yeah, yeah,
from which is much maligned. There's some good
yeah,
stuff in that, but it's about presenting useful, practical options so that decision makers feel that you're across your brief. And risk should be confidence inspiring. It should be exciting. It should be interesting. And it should be reassuring to go, actually, the backroom boy has done his job. He's explored the different things that could be going wrong here, whether that's external to the business or internal to the business. Doesn't matter what the context is. And I've got some solid options here that I, as a decision maker, can effectively just be in that luxurious position of making a choice.
yeah. And I think it's getting people in a different mind. Hence this whole reason I've got this podcast. You know, a lot of organizational thought is based on, it was predicated on stability, predictability, and linear cause relationship. So you know everything's predictable, and when it comes to risk, there's this fallacy that you can control all risk, and all risk is bad. Where sometimes it's useful to look at it and go, what's the risk of not doing this?
Yeah. Oh, that's it. That's exactly the point. A former colleague of mine, Patrick Healy, very far more eloquent. In fact, you should get him on. He's much better at talking about this sort of stuff than I am. But um, what one of his adages is that you haven't business isn't a perpetual motion machine. You can't just create value out of thin air. Risk is actually the fuel of growth. You have to take those risks, perhaps risks that you're more aware of, or that you're better at managing, there's competitive advantage in that. If you're really good at controlling a particular kind of risk, you've got to exploit that. That's a risk on moment. And again, it's something that orthodoxy, to go back to where you started, that orthodoxy isn't good at encouraging that risk on discussion, that holy hell, we've got an advantage here. Right, come on, let's push it. And again, there are very, very, very few military analogies that I entertain, but you and I will both think back to our previous careers and go, actually, in the great battles that you get taught about, whether they're on land or the more interesting ones at sea,
Debatable.
the decisive victories came from understanding the risks that needed to be taken, and then risk positions that could be pushed versus risk positions that needed a more cautious approach. And again, that orthodoxy does not permit that
No.
sort of thinking. I would just add how much of that orthodoxy has pervaded the modern military. We could talk about that another time.
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think it's quite prevalent in a lot of organisations where it's almost they're taking a zero risk mentality, which, as you said, you've got to be able to absorb some level of risk. And trying to get people is not it's not just good having, your senior executives not looking at just risk. It's about how do we decentralize that to the organisation. So everyone that is acting, bear in mind a lot of the value is produced by the people on the front line delivering the value day in day, is realizing, well, through theirs, and you brought the estimate in. The estimate is a great way because it's always throughout the estimate is looking at what's the risks, what's our freedoms, what's our constraints, what control measures do I need to impose, and they're not they're not prescriptive. They're just looking at what risk are we willing to absorb, and with those risks that we are willing to absorb, how can we meaningfully navigate those so that they main to our advantage rather than go against us. And I think it's just getting that mentality into people that not all risk is bad and not all risk is scary. And actually, risk is just a part of execution.
And good decision making.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that's what this boils down to at the end of the day. Effective risk management is not about having a beautiful heat map or a really neat risk register. Good risk management is about better decisions faster. So,
Yes.
what is a better decision? What makes a decision better than others? Well, it's about the outcome. It's
Mm,
about what results and how consistently you achieve better outcomes. And again, that comes back to then Roger Federer, or it comes back to counting cards. If you understand your external risks, your internal risks, and how they're aligned to your strategy, if you understand your key processes as controls to those risks, your project portfolio as controls to those risks, or your policy portfolio as a third set of controls to those risks, if you have a robust set of mechanisms to make sure that the basics are brilliant, that
mm,
you are counting those cards as they're coming out of the deck, that you are looking for the marginal gains on your backhand, and you're making sure that you're into that 51-52% win bracket. That's where actually better decisions come from, because actually there's a degree of freedom in for decision makers, knowing that those things have been taken care of,
yes.
knowing that when they hit, a massive sales opportunity, that the supply chain, the manufacturing, the service providers in their organization can keep up with that. Right?
Yes.
There's a degree of
Yeah,
freedom, and
yeah.
a degree of, it must feel lighter knowing that that's been addressed, and we're not going to embarrass ourselves.
No. And that takes leaders to ensure that their mental models are congruent with reality. So, they are they are getting off their desks. They are, you said, understanding the external environment, what's coming up. And it's not to catch all, because you're never going to, absorb all risks, or minimize all shocks. But also, it's that internal environment. So making sure that they're going down and speaking with and understanding what their teams are up to, what the challenges they have, what their actual capability is. So when they are going back up to the boardroom to make decisions, at least those decisions are based near on reality rather than a huge disconnect. And that's where they're going to get themselves in trouble because they'll make decisions and then soon realise that they haven't got the capability to start delivering.
I think you're right, and I think there's a clear human dimension to that. So we would have been told, walk your patch, right? So get out there,
Mm.
talk to people, see what's going on the ground. I think over the last 15, 20 years, though, that has also been supplemented by the revolution in management information in MI and in the technology that provides that. So I'm a skeptic, but also an absolute fetishist when it comes to data and tech and the technology that enables it. But the skepticism comes from having been a veteran of things like blockchain, where 26, what would it have been, 2016-ish, if you went into any incubator, the answer was blockchain. Doesn't matter
Yeah,
if you were
yeah, yeah.
making coffee or you had a payment service or you were in pest control. Blockchain was the answer.
Blockchain, yeah, yeah.
That's now been replaced by AI. Now, AI is probably more useful. It's probably more flexible. It certainly has a broader degree of a broader range of use cases than blockchain did. But the skepticism comes from, starting with the use case, which in this case is bringing that reality to leaders' attention and making sure that the information they're acting on is good. And so that human side of walking the patch versus the up-to-date MI and knowing what to do with it, knowing what questions to ask of it, I think is a new area of skill, a new consideration. And one of the conversations I really enjoy having is, are boards ready for that? So if I have to
Yeah, yeah.
submit my papers 3 weeks in advance on actual paper, um, or into systems like Diligent where they're static and they're held. Do boards understand that? Do they get that? They've asked me to create a drill through dynamic dashboard fed with near real time information. How does that then chime with governance practices and board oversight orthodoxies where they want those papers nearly a month in advance? So the data is going to be latent by at least a month, but
Yeah,
actually much
yeah.
longer because I think it spurs some interesting questions around um, how leaders take good decisions. They could have all the tool sets, they could have all the pretty dashboards, they could have, a great data infrastructure, but unless they understand how to interrogate that effectively, doesn't matter.
Yes. Data's data and data, survives around context. And I think trying to get that balance between what's being fed upwards with data and what's actually happening on the ground, there may be some disconnect there. So I think it's about managing that. But Clausewitz talked about this like 300 years ago, and he talked about leaders working with limited information, which I still think we do have now because it is complex. But I am concerned that with the growth of AI and Power BI boards and all this stuff, that leaders have got far too much information that it's hard to discern what's actually being said or what's actually there, and definitely if it's latent. How's that impacting their decision making? They've got so much information getting thrown at them.
I agree, and I think it- it's a strange. So I'm actually a scientist. So a long, long, long time ago, I was a biochemist. Biology's been through a revolution where um, there are two worlds in effect. So there is a world, the old world, which is governed by a phenomenon called OFAT. So OFAT, one factor at a time. And that's where, if you remember back to GCSE chemistry, if you vary one variable and then you look for the color change or you look for whatever it was that you were looking for, and then you plot that on a graph, you were told only change one thing at a time, which is
Yes.
it's so artificial, right? Completely artificial. Biology's been through a revolution where actually we're now deliberately looking at multiple factors at a time. MFAT. Business tends to try and simplify consistently tries to go back to a OFAT world, right?
Yeah.
Tries to tries to be quite reductionist and tries to look at the things that they can grasp onto and understand. Again, it's a different mindset. It's a shift in expectation around what leaders need to be able to get their heads around, and it's
Mm,
bloody difficult.
yeah.
How do we take business on that same revolution to go, it's just never that simple. It just
Yeah.
isn't as simple as trying as going, that's my objective, and there's one risk, and if I just fix that one risk, then everything will be fine. The technology begs bigger questions. It begs exploitation of itself in the sense that it allows you to be more complex. It allows to be more nuanced, subtler, allows you to be more agile. The question is our governance structures, our decision makers, our leaders really geared up to take full advantage of that?
Yeah, that's great insight. And you see it, the silver bullet mentality where they're just like, oh, we've got this. If we do this one thing, that'll solve all our problems. And back to your problem previous statement you made around organizations being resilient. And we know that to be resilient, if they're too structured, too tight, and the governance are too onerous, then it's going to make them too rigid. So they won't be able to absorb the shocks. They'll just break apart. Where we do need to bring a bit of fat into that system to help it and push the decision making and the risk um, to where the actual problem is, so they can be resilient. Yeah, yeah, it's a great point, and I do wonder if leaders are ready for a different approach to think about how we actually navigate and execute, and how we look at governance to help us. How do we look at risk as an enabling tool rather than just something that we have to record and monitor?
That's it.
God, we can solve the world's problems today on this podcast.
They're fixed.
Yeah, yeah, they're done. But yeah, it's surprising to me because we're both military, and when I left and got into organisations, I was I was really surprised about the rigidity that I saw in a lot of organisations, and the fact that they were still caught up on this idea of control and efficiency, and they could solve all their problems by just this magic pill that they could take, and that'd be it. And as soon as they get into a bit of trouble, the answer to their troubles would be to just cut things, just cut services, just cut that, and it will solve our problems.
Yeah, that surprised me too. Yeah, so one of the I felt quite naive when I entered a civilian work, civilian organizations, in that I made an assumption that it would be a bit like some of the high functioning headquarters that I had the privilege of serving in uniform, that actually awareness of what was going on out there in the wider environment was a prerequisite, that you had to know about that, and similarly that you were wanting to understand what was going on the shop floor in your own business equally was just not even desirable but essential.
Mm,
um, and I guess one of the things that surprised me the most was how important personality is. In now it's important in uniform too. It's critically important. Yeah, it's where charisma comes from. That's where all leadership qualities are those ethereal things that are innate to somebody's character. And I guess though I wasn't prepared for how vital that was in a commercial boardroom, and the willingness to, yes, look at the numbers, but just take some things, some really important strategic decisions and assumptions, just kind of take them as read. Pretty minimal evidence.
mm.
What's been interesting over certainly the last 10 years, as though that's as technology's matured and as people have realized that actually information has become a bit more ubiquitous, and that the availability of insights is more, it is less it's less challenging to get good information. what's been interesting has been to see how modern boardrooms, in some respects, have become more like headquarters that you and I might have seen back in the day.
Yeah,
And they're a bit more about sensing the outside world and then responding to that and then working out what their enablers are and moving to exploit that opportunity in a broader market. And again, from a risk guy's perspective, that's brilliant. That's
yeah,
fascinating because they're starting to ask more interesting questions. I do wonder though, as I say, as to maybe there's a mini revolution in terms of governance and decision making in the offing as people start to question, well, hang on a minute, this board deck's a month out of date. Why are we talking about information that's so latent?
yeah. The only thing, we're we're both not arguing that we don't need governance, we don't need this. We do want that coherence, but um, we want to make it, like you said, an enabler, not not a hindrance, too much of a constraint on what we're trying to do. And I'm glad that you're starting to see leaders are being more curious of the external environment and understanding what's going out broader, because that's essentially what we want. You do that, and you can start to um, split your time effectively from the outside and the future and inside and today, and balance those really well. I think that it will no doubt help develop your decision making.
I think in a risk context as well, it's been helped by regulatory change. So I am a skeptic in terms of rules and what I'm being told or asked to do by law or through regulation. But actually, the Financial Reporting Council, I think, got it more right than they ever have 2 Januaries ago, 2024, around my birthday. Actually, they gave me a regulatory birthday present.
Then,
The best kind of birthday because the Carillions and the Patisserie Valeries and the other corporate catastrophes that we've lived through and will continue to live through. Each case, they said, yeah, but our accounts were fine.
mm,
Back to that orthodoxy. We followed the rules.
yeah,
Yeah, but you ran out of money. Yeah, no, that, oh,
mm,
that, yeah. Yeah, weird how that happened. And there feels like there was an awakening, especially in the wake of Carillion, which wiped billions out of people's pension funds and tens of thousands of people's jobs lost and livelihood destroyed, and just the catastrophic, colossal, I don't know if you can bleep things, so I won't swear, but the colossal F up that was utterly avoidable and just a question of understanding the drivers to liquidity and solvency and just wasn't done. FRC, I think, in the face of that, woke up and said, "Hang on a minute, it's not just about financial control. It's not just about have you written this down accurately. It's about causality, right? What are the controls which causally will lead you to a liquidity problem? What are the controls which, if they fail, will causally conspire to make you less resilient? So if you then face a shock because you lose a big contract, all of that doesn't add up to a monumental failure, a catastrophe, an existential crisis that you're not coming back from, that just having assurance around key financial controls would do nothing to prevent. So what they said was it's now a much broader net that you've got to cast across control, and control being close cousin of risk. But it's not just financial, it's now operational. So what's going on in my businesses, it's now functional. So what's going on in my functions, it's reporting. So what am I actually, it does what I'm reporting to the board actually tally to what the reality of what's happening on the ground. So I think there is a massive, massive opportunity now, emboldened by a regulator who has responded, in my view, intelligently and really practically and pragmatically to the human disaster that is corporate failure. My sense is that there is a real opportunity to do it properly. The cynic, the skeptic in me worries that that will be gamed and that will be kind of people will try because we have this comply or explain approach in UK corporate governance regulations. there's a sense that people will try and get away with the minimum. We're not.
Yeah, yeah.
We're making it meaningful. We're looking at causality. We're looking at how one thing leads to another, and ultimately all around strategy and objectives and success. And then given that, what are the risks? And given the risks, what are the controls? And given the controls, how do we get confidence around them? So I sense a real sea change in expectation, and the opportunity for risk people has never been greater to be relevant and useful and have a real contribution to make to the success of the organizations that they're sat in. Takes a lot of thinking. I was a
Mm.
lot less grey 2 years ago.
You pull it off, mate.
It hasn't fallen out, but it's got grayer. But my goodness, it's interesting. It's fascinating. It's a privilege, and the opportunity to feel like you're a part of something meaningful in a corporate context. I personally haven't been this fulfilled since hanging up my uniform. So
Mm.
it's a really interesting time to be
It,
a risk guy, to coin your phrase.
and it definitely seems like co-op are taking the more mature, um, adaptive approach to risk. And I like the fact that you're saying that it's all interlinked, because often these things, like I said earlier, are done in isolation. Where I think contextualizing, as you talked about, contextualizing risk, linking risk to the objectives to the strategy, and enabling people across the organization to understand it and how to use it as an enabler for them, I think is seems like you're doing a fantastic job.
I think, Mike, it's more basic than that. I think nobody gets out of bed unless you're a risk guy. Nobody gets out of bed to manage risk
Mm.
consciously and deliberately. They don't go, "Oh, great, today's a risk day." Absolute rubbish. Nobody has that little flutter in their tummy because they've got a meeting with me, much as I find that hard to believe. They get out of bed to sell more stuff, to service
Yeah.
their customers' needs, to create new services, to create value for shareholders, or in our case, for our members. Or if you're in the third sector, to deliver your charitable aims, or if you're in government, to deliver on policy objectives, whatever it happens to be, the outcome, the way that you create value, that's what motivates people.
Mm.
And that's what risk people have got to tap into, because it's not enough to go along and say, "You've got to do this." How
Yeah, yeah.
boring, please. Cry me a river and find me the world's tiniest violin. I don't care. So your job's hard, is it, risk guy? Oh, well, boo-hoo. Your job's boring anyway. The reason that we've had some success is solely, purely because we as a team go to those businesses and ask them why they get out of, why are you excited to be here? What is it you do? What is it that is so brilliant about your job? Why do you come to work for the co-op? What is it about the next 2 or 3 quarters which is giving you genuine butterflies, that means that you're motivated to spend the majority of your life away from your family and actually in an office or in a home office? If you as a risk person understand that, and you take it right back to basics, and you get the objective, you understand why this exec in front of you is so motivated and why they're going to get a bonus if they deliver this thing, and then you contextualize the risk conversation in against that. It's human psychology. They want to talk about what matters to them, not what matters to you as the risk guy. And I guess maybe that's a switch that suddenly got flicked in my head, but it seems to be working.
Yeah, and again, I think that anything that ownership and agency to that person, then, and we know that really matters to people. Um, no, this has been absolutely fascinating. What would you, out of all the conversation, or just advice, if you could leave leaders with one thing to do or think about, what would that be?
Demand more of me. I've got so much more to give as a risk person. You can treat me as a tick box exercise, and that's fine. Sure. Wouldn't you
Yeah,
want a bit more out of me than that? Treat your risk people as part of your extended team. Treat them as the goalkeeper. Treat them as the troubleshooter. Treat them as your internal consultant. Do not accept the output of your risk team as a list of risks and a heat map. If your
Mm,
risk analysis doesn't contain your strategic objectives and then the risks associated with those, if the first column isn't objectives or isn't strategy, send them back, send them packing. Flip side, equip them, give them the tools, help them invest in technology, help them make sure that they are embedded in capital allocation, for example, in how to bring risk in terms of strategic change, transformation. Help them be in the conversations like understanding your trade calls and your COO's forum. Um, Give them that access and make sure that they're in the room. But first and foremost, be demanding. Explain to them that red, amber, and green does not equal value for you, that instead what you want is objectives, risks, controls, and action. Because at the end of the day, they can help you deliver your strategy. They can help you be more successful.
yeah, that sounds perfect. I love the idea of having that symbiotic relationship that and not viewing as we do often in organisations see these enabling functions as the enemy, um, which they're not. They're internal enabler to help you, and I think that's a great way to to finish this podcast with that thought. Stefan, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on, and it's fantastic to see what Co-op is doing to change the way that you look, and hopefully other people follow how they can utilise risk. It's been a pleasure having you on.
Great. Thanks, Mike.
Cheers. Thank you.